Books make you hope. Books make you dream. Books make you laugh. Books make you scream. This is the Books That Make You show, discussing books with authors and experts, unraveling the inner pages of all the books that help make us who we are. Hosted by Desiree Duffy.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Desiree Duffy, and I am the host of the Books That Make You show. And today, we're gathered around to find out about books that make you question what really happened with this assassination of JFK. In the United States, there's probably no conspiracy theory that's more tantalizing than the one that revolves, or the ones I should say, that revolve around the assassination of the 35th President, John F. Kennedy. Now, while we can debate shooters behind the grassy knoll and analyze the bullet trajectories that were involved, like Oliver Stone, over and over again, well, we're not going to do that today. We're going to take a few steps even further back and look at the possible reasons for the assassination. What, my friends, if it did not start with JFK? Walter Herbst is our guest today, and he is the author of It Did Not Start with JFK. Now, the book, or actually two books, I believe, claims to dig into how decades of radicalism and white nationalism, misguided patriotism, and so much more led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Walter is a retired licensed professional engineer, an entrepreneur, and he has dedicated much of his life to uncovering the truth behind the assassination. Across 4 decades of painstaking investigation into the assassination and related subjects, Walter has studied over 500 articles and books, my goodness, different archive material and online resources. In his determination to discover why JFK apparently had to die, Walter came to the understanding that the answer could be found in the decades that actually preceded JFK's presidency. Delving even deeper into his research, he expanded it into America's role in the assassinations and the overthrow of governments around the world. This is a tantalizing topic. Walter, hello, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Desiree. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. I need you to set the stage because I was not born when JFK was assassinated. I remember the Oliver Stone movie and
Right.
a lot of the things, but nowadays we have people that weren't even born for 9/11. Can you give us the rundown? What is this all about? And set the stage for us, if you would, please.
Sure. So I have spent close to 40 years investigating the assassination of JFK. And there's a number of things that bothered me as I went through the investigation. One was when Oswald was arrested, he asked for one lawyer, John Apt. And he was a lawyer who represented communists, and everyone thought that was the reason. Well, there's another reason. John Apt was the only man in the country to try someone under the Smith Act. And the Smith Act came about in 1940. And it said the purpose of it was to try anyone for trying to overthrow the government, and you could try an individual who was part of a group. And the fact that Oswald asked for that, I thought was curious, considering that he never said he was a communist. He said he was a Marxist. Then there was, within 20-something months of JFK's assassination, there were 15 attempts throughout the world to overthrow leftist governments or to assassinate leftist leaders. And in the middle of all that was JFK, who was supposedly murdered by a leftist, and it just didn't fit the pattern of all the others. And of course, it's possible that was the case, but I found it curious. Then I asked myself, Cuba. From the minute Castro came into power, there were elements in this country who wanted him removed because we didn't want a communist leader so close to the United States. And that followed through with assassination attempts where the CIA hired the mafia to try and kill him, coups to try and take over Cuba, the Bay of Pigs, all of that. During the missile crisis, the military was prepared to just go in and blast away and take care of it. Kennedy kept a level head, as we know, and put a blockade and diffused the situation. Now, when Oswald's arrested, you have an ex-defector to the Soviet Union. You have a man who says he's a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, has an office in New Orleans, trying to take the pressure off Castro. He goes to Mexico, trying to get up to 2 months before the assassination, trying to get into Cuba. He fails at that. But I asked myself, considering the attempts on Castro's life, here was a perfect example of just the military, whoever, going in and doing what they had to do based on that alone. So that led me to thinking, the assassination of JFK did not occur in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, like you in your opening statements, you brought up the headshots and then the trajectories and things, and we forget there's a lot that was going on around him. So I went back in history and I said, there's got to be an answer to why, if he was murdered, especially if he was murdered by elements of the country, the government, there had to be a reason why that happened. So it took me back really toward the 1920s. Is where I started and found that there are a series of events and some misguided thinking that led to the assassination of JFK.
Okay, so let's dig into that.
Okay.
Let's start with the ideology. What is this misguided thinking? What was going on in the country at the time? And I think you're probably going to talk about the New Deal and some things like that. Can you set that up for us?
Certainly. So there were two things that happened, say, between 1920 and the beginning of FDR's presidency. The New Deal, of course, was one of them. There was an element in this country of wealthy people of both parties who thought that self-determination was guaranteed by the Constitution and by the Declaration of Independence. And basically what it meant was, if I'm going to give to somebody else, it's because I want to. The government cannot force us to do that. And by itself, all right, it was not innocent, but there were some groups that came up of leaders, the Century Group and what have you. But there was in 1932 an attempt by a group that wanted to overthrow the government and take FDR out of office. And this group actually sent people over to Italy and to Germany, because Hitler and Mussolini were starting to study how they did it. And their plan was to organize a 500,000 man army in the United States, made up basically of the American Legion. And the American Legion at the time was, to a large extent, a strike-breaking anti-communist group that people would hire if their workers were going to go out on strike. And this all has to do with really the anti-communism and the fear of communism. So, but the fellow they approached to kind of head this, Smedley Butler, an ex-World War I officer, a veteran, didn't go along and actually brought it to Congress. And there were hearings in Congress about it, and it never went anywhere because those who were heading it were like the DuPonts, the Remingtons, and very wealthy families, and too wealthy, I suppose, to be charged with treason. So it went away. Now, there's a second thing happening at the same time, and it started with the end of World War I, and basically the Russian Revolution and the Tsar being taken out of power by the Bolsheviks. And so it was called eugenics. And your listeners have never heard of it. It's really almost an amazing thing that this happened in this country. Eugenics was the belief that your bloodline could determine your own makeup. You could become a criminal, what have you. It all had to do with your bloodline, and so there was a push to kind of maximize what they called the Nordic environment, which was Northern Europe, which was no different than the Russian than the Nazis called it Aryan, but they called it Nordic.
Yeah.
Right, and so. What it resulted in 1924 in an immigration law passed by the United States government that basically tried to limit the influx of people into the United States who were from Northern Europe, and to keep out Asians, Slavics, Southern Europeans, but basically all people who might be proponents of communism. That's really what it was all about. And so that kind of led eventually to then, well, World War II came, and there were a lot of people who were still supporters of Nazi Germany only because of the anti-communist element. Mm-hmm. People like Allen Dulles, who would eventually become head of the CIA under Eisenhower. He was working during the war for OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who would become Eisenhower's Secretary of State. They both worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, a major law firm that handled a lot of Nazi clients, even during the war. And people like Averell Harriman, who was in the administrations up to John Kennedy, whose family were very wealthy and were donating money to keep this eugenic investigation going. So by the time World War II came around, it was all about an attempt to control the spread of communism.
Okay. And then Kennedy comes along, and he's a disruptor in his day, wasn't he?
Very much so.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Okay. So just briefly, from the end of World War II up to Kennedy's administration, there was a policy in place put by a fellow named George Kennan, who was a U.S. diplomat in Russia at the end of World War II. And President Truman asked him to send just put a summary together of what his opinion of what the Soviet Union was like. Well, he wrote a 5,000-word telegram, which was now called the Long Telegram, and basically blasted the Soviet Union. You could not coexist with them. And it established the policy of containment in the United States, which basically said the Soviet system, the Russian system, the communist system, if you include China, would self-implode because it could not sustain itself. So if we do not have to attack them, but we have to contain them, surround them. And what happened was we had Japan, we had South Korea, we had Formosa, which is Taiwan today, we had Okinawa, we had European, like a circle of defense around them. Well, when JFK became president, things started to change. He didn't agree with that. He thought that, well, to use his words, he said in his famous speech in June of 1963, he said, as far as the United States and the Soviets, we breathe the same air, we treasure our children's future, we want what's best for everybody. So he started to break down the wall of containment. He was going to pull out of Vietnam. He signed a nuclear test ban treaty in 1963 with the Soviets, which Eisenhower wanted to do, which was sabotaged by the CIA. But the biggest thing about what Kennedy did with the nuclear test ban treaty was he sent Averell Harriman, he kept it secret, sent Averell Harriman to Moscow. Kennedy got on the phone from the States, from the White House, basically instructing Averell Harriman what to do. Then when they signed the treaty and had to get it passed by Congress, JFK bypassed Congress and went directly to the people and basically put it on the table, explained why it was important. And of course, most people would think a nuclear test ban treaty, which would limit or eliminate airborne and underground testing of nuclear weapons, was a good idea. Congress had no choice but to go ahead with it. Then with Cuba, he started to normalize relations with Castro in a behind-the-scenes operation. There was the UN ambassador from Cuba was talking to the American ambassador. There was an American reporter who interviewed Castro, and Castro was sending out feelers that he wanted to normalize relations. And Kennedy thought, under the right circumstances, right, if Castro was willing to stop trying to spread the communist revolution throughout Latin America and certain other things, that he would be open to negotiating or at least reaching some agreements with Castro.
Now, was this before the Cuban Missile Crisis?
After.
Or after? Okay.
This is after. This is 1963. Cuban Missile Crisis is 62. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is interesting, some mics were left on in the room when Kennedy left. And as you can imagine, the military generals, they just wanted to blast. They wanted to go on nuclear weapons and destroy Cuba. And what prevented Kennedy and this goes back even to previous presidents, Berlin was always on their mind, right? Berlin was all within East Germany, but half of Berlin was East German, Soviets. Half Berlin was West Berlin was part of the Allies, United States, France, and England. So the fear always was that if Kennedy went in, let's say to Cuba and did something, the Russians would go right into Berlin, which would be worse. So Robert Kennedy was actually in behind the scenes discussions with Russian diplomats, unknown to anybody, well, at least on paper, unknown to anybody else. The CIA may have been following him, who knows? But to kind of, and according to Khrushchev's recollection, and we don't know if it's true or not, but Robert Kennedy basically said to him, I don't know how much longer my brother can control our military, that they are ready to just basically stage a coup and go in and blast. So we have to do something. And the outcome, we know what that is. It worked out perfectly.
Okay. So let's get down to some brass facts.
Okay.
You've done all of this research. You've connected a lot of dots. I imagine, Walter, your head is like one of those huge walls where you've got pictures and you've got pins and strings going in all of these different directions.
Yes.
What hardcore facts can you give us that establishes your premise?
The hardcore facts would be to go look at the sabotage that was done from the end of World War II, because before World War II was a different animal. From World War II on to when JFK became president. The first thing, and this is a contrarian view, but the United States was responsible for the Korean War. That's when it started. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's a lot of facts in the book to back that up, but the reason that was important was this. I mentioned before the policy of containment to you. Now, Truman had come to the conclusion that he could not afford to create this blockade. So he had to give up some things. And he was willing to give up countries on the mainland, which would be South Korea, and to the communists, was willing to give up Formosa, Taiwan to the communists, and was willing to give up Japan. Now, Japan, in the process at this time, was looking to sign a treaty doing one of two things: remove the United States and the United States missiles from Japan, and this is all in front of the UN, and or keep them there. Now, of course, the military, and MacArthur at this time was heading Japan, was like an emperor of Japan himself, didn't want that to happen. South Korea, of course, we didn't want to lose because of proximity. And MacArthur called Taiwan, Formosa, he said it's like an aircraft carrier because of its proximity to China. So we started this war. And during the war, whenever it looked like if we were winning the war, and it looked like that treaty might be signed or Truman might get his way, MacArthur would back off like he was losing the war, and vice versa. And the end result of all of that was that Taiwan stayed an ally, right? Still in place today. South Korea is still in place today, and the treaty with Japan was signed, which kept our military bases there. Now that's just one example. Then the second, which is under Eisenhower, was, and you've heard of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower talked about at the end of his presidency. Well, it started actually with the Korean War. Just to put it in perspective, Truman was going to cut the budget to $13 billion, military budget. It wound up being $50 billion because of the Korean War, same year. Now, what happened was there was this series of military officers who would leave when they were done serving and become part of the board of directors or get high-paying positions with military contractors. So it was like a self-perpetuating war machine that got bigger and bigger and bigger. And Kennedy, when his time came, was trying to reduce it. Okay, then there's examples of when Eisenhower wanted to sign a nuclear test ban treaty. And it was all set up with Khrushchev. Khrushchev had visited the United States, went back, and it ended when Francis Gary Powers' plane was shot down, the U-2 flight over the Soviet Union, which U-2 planes were these high flight planes that could photograph things over the Soviet Union. But the evidence seems to point to that was a sabotage, and it ruined that. You could point to the Bay of Pigs as also was sabotaged. There was Indonesia, which in the 1950s had a lot of raw minerals, and it was an important territory to hold. We were willing at that time when decolonization was becoming very, very important, and we were willing to kind of broker a deal to get out of it. That was also sabotaged by the CIA. And so it's one thing after another that comes up to when Kennedy is killed. And there's so many examples of military malfeasance and generals. 4 generals retired at the end of Eisenhower's presidency because they were so fed up with his inability to use nuclear weapons to attack the communists that they resigned. They all wrote books and they publicly criticized Eisenhower. And by the time Kennedy became president, it was like off the charts, the animosity that the military had. So when you put everything together, can you come up with one concrete smoking gun that says, yes, this is like, we can prove it one way or the other? But putting all the pieces together, I think you can develop a scenario, which I try to do in the book, that says, yeah, there was a reason. It was the war against communism that basically was the reason. And Kennedy's desire to break down these barriers was the reason he had to die.
Now, when we talk about the deep state today, I don't know, there's a certain amount of eye rolling that tends to go on because it seems so ludicrous and so out of left field. But is this something that's still, in your opinion, from your research, from what you've been doing, is this one and the same? Are we still on this same trajectory? Well, does this impact what's happening in our politics today?
It does to a certain extent, but I think people confuse the deep state, let's say, with the attempt to take over the Capitol last January by some misguided people who were just thought they would take the law into their own hands and start some revolution. What the deep state really means is that there is a group of very powerful financial people with a history in government. I mean, the Council of Foreign Relations basically has put every Secretary of State in. I mean, I couldn't give you off the top of my head which ones haven't, but it's almost every Secretary of State comes from the Council of Foreign Relations. And part of this, I think, is also out of necessity when you talk deep state. One of the great things about this country is that we can go from one president to the next. We can go from a George Bush to a Barack Obama to a Donald Trump to a Joe Biden and smoothly make a transition. It's not like everybody leaves and they do bring in their own people to lead, but there is an advisory group, in my opinion, that's behind the scenes that kind of keeps things flowing nicely. Now, when it gets carried away is if there is a group behind the scenes, and I believe this applied to Kennedy, that came to the conclusion that for the good of the country, he has to die. Now that doesn't mean they were directly involved, but there was the CIA had one rule of thumb, and it was, wouldn't it have been better if the world would have been better if Adolf Hitler had been killed before he had a chance to wreak the havoc that he did? And of course, the answer to that is yes. But how do you determine how bad someone's going to be until after they've done it? So it kind of gives you a carte blanche reason to kill anyone you think might be leading us down that path. But I think the deep state, going back to the 40s and what have you, was worse than it is today. I think there's much more media presence. There's it'd be very difficult to say overthrow a president if you wanted to. Now, the big thing about Kennedy is why did he have to die? I mean, especially with we've learned so much about his private life and certain things, how he conducted himself, that you could probably publicize that and he would have been out. But it was more. There was Robert Kennedy. It was like a perfect storm of a lineup of Kennedys, if you wanted it to. And I think they had reached a point where Kennedy could have done something either with Berlin, with Vietnam, with Laos, Indonesia, cutting back on military spending, signing a nuclear test ban treaty, that had reached a point where they were afraid he had to be stopped.
What do you think would have happened if they failed? What if Kennedy was not assassinated? I mean, any predictions on what the world might have been like if that happened?
Definitely. Kennedy was a very political savvy person. So he did things in his first term he didn't do things in his first term that he would have loved to have done. And one of them is getting out of Vietnam. So he told Mike Mansfield, who was a member of Congress and a confidant of Kennedy, and he told him, I can't get out of Vietnam right now. All he was willing to do was pull 1,000 men out at the end of 1963. He said, but make damn sure I'm reelected. In the second term, I can do it. He said, I'll be the most hated president in the history of this country, but I can do it. The second thing was civil rights. Mm-hmm. He was a big proponent of civil rights. Of course, in RFK, we know what happened, how he was after the fact, but there were so many instances during the Kennedy presidency, and this also added to the animosity against him in the Deep South, which there was first the University of Mississippi riots, which was basically a riot because James Meredith, an African-American man, was going to be a student there. And they called out the National Guard, and they did everything they could. They finally got him in, but there were people died. And General Walker, who was Oswald supposedly shot at the following year, he was there with his followers. The next year was University of Alabama with George Wallace in the summer of '63, who was going to prevent, I believe it was 4 African Americans from entering University of Alabama. And there were a series of this, and JFK wanted to do more. Martin Luther King and other leaders were on him to pass a civil rights bill. He was afraid he wouldn't get reelected. And so therefore, because he needed the southern states, so therefore he waited until the summer of '63, and he did then propose a civil rights bill. But I think had he not been killed, we would have been out of Vietnam. We would have normalized relations better with the Soviets. My guess is there would have been a reduction in nuclear weapons because the Soviets really wanted that. They wanted an armaments reduction because they knew we had such a superiority over them. Okay, but you have to be a strong president because our military knew that too, and they wanted to keep that superiority. Mm-hmm. And as far as the civil rights is concerned, a lot of things would have happened, I think, if Kennedy pushing forward civil rights if he was president.
Mm-hmm. So you've done all this research. What is it, Walter, that sparked that and drove you to do this? Because this is an incredible feat, if I must say.
Well, thank you. Be honest, when I was 6 years old when JFK got killed, and I have a couple of memories of it. One, I just remember coming out of school. They didn't really tell us why, and there was a woman standing on the corner with a transistor radio up to her ear, and she was crying. And as a 6-year-old boy, I couldn't process why. So I went home. I'm sure my mother explained to me, I don't recall. And then it was the Ruby shooting Oswald on television on Sunday, which kind of galvanized everybody. Mm-hmm. Kind of changed. Remember, the Zapruder film was not out yet at that time, so you didn't have that to look at. But everyone looked at that and said, something's wrong here. I mean, how could that happen? So, but it kind of left. It wasn't a focal point. I mean, I was a kid. But when I got to be in my mid-20s, a neighbor of my father's lent me a book on the assassination. And I read it, and I said, oh, my God, this is unbelievable. It was about the autopsy. And I said, I have to find out more about it. And so it became not an obsession, but just for me, it was just something that galvanized my interest. And so it was the assassination itself. It was Ruby. It was Oswald. And then I started, well, these people had to come together somehow, whether it was the mafia, the CIA. There's all this talk of these groups coming together, right? And it seems implausible. And then I started reading the past history. And that's what got me to do that too. Because, I mean, if they didn't just accidentally fall out of the sky and start working together in 1963. If there was any connection and any conspiracy, you should be able to at least read the 4 decades before and say, you know what, this is silly. These are all different groups. It doesn't make any sense. Or there are examples of, yeah, you know what, they did come together. And there is a possibility.
Yeah. Oh, tantalizing stuff. Walter Herbst, author of It Did Not Start with JFK. Can you tell people where they can go to find out more about you, find your books, follow you on social media? Give us your details.
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is herbstbooks.com, which has a lot about the book and future books that I'm going to be working on. My Facebook page, just look up for Walter Herbst, author. That'll take you there. And the book is, like you said, two volumes. It's It Did Not Start with JFK, Sunbury Press, and you should be able to get that at Amazon, Sunbury Press's own page, and other outlets for wherever you can buy books.
Excellent. Walter, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you, Desiree. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You bet. And thank you, everybody, for being with us today on the Books That Make You show. You can find out more about us on our website. It's booksthatmakeyou.com. We're also on Facebook, on Instagram, and of course on YouTube. Be sure to ring the bell and subscribe so that you're always up to date on the latest interviews that we have with authors on the show. Until next time, all of my bibliophile friends, please enjoy all of the books that make you exactly who you are.
The executive producer for Books That Make You is Desiree Duffy. Produced and sound mastered by Phil Giangrande. Engineering by Dave Nabox. Social media and promotion by Bree Sweeter. For more, visit booksthatmakeyou.com.